Good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us tonight. Thank you all for joining us for this program. Today, we're honored to bring back Dr. Andrew C. Isenberg. Dr. Isenberg is the Hall Distinguished Professor of American History at KU, where he teaches environmental history, the history of the North American West and its borderlands, and U.S. history. He's author or co-author editor of 9 books, including The Age of the Borderlands, Indians, Slaves, and the Limits of Manifest Destiny, 1790 to 1850. We asked Dr. Isenberg to speak about his new book as part of the America at 250 series. This is a partnership between the Dole Institute of Politics and the Watkins Museum of History, involving special exhibits and events all year long. You can see the current schedule of what we have coming up at our landing page. So if you go to watkinsmuseum.org, it'll be right there front and center, America at 250. And that schedule is always updating as we add new exhibits and events. So with that, please join me in welcoming Andrew C. Isenberg.
Thank you, Will. Thanks to Watkins, and thank you all for coming out on what is a really, you should all be outside. Not sure about your life choice here. So I'm going to turn this on. Is that better? Yeah. Okay. I'm going to start with 4 short stories or vignettes. So in 1808, the United States government appointed a young man to be an official representative to the Osage Nation. His post, which he remained at until the 1820s, was about 80 miles from here. It was on the Missouri River just east of what's now Kansas City. And his job title was factor, which meant he was a merchant. He traded goods with the Osage in exchange for furs. His prices were subsidized by the federal government, and they were less than half of what private traders charged the Osage. Most of those private traders were French. They had little regard for the Osage, whom they swindled, and they had little regard for the interests of the United States. The factor's mission was to win the goodwill of the Osage and to support their economy and thus allow them to stay in their homeland, and it was hoped to create some stability and peace on the frontier, on the Missouri borderlands. Here's another story. In 1830, a prominent American anti-slavery advocate traveled to Texas, which was then still part of Mexico. He met with Mexican officials to discuss with them his ambition to colonize emancipated slaves in Texas. His hope was to demonstrate to white Americans, through the success of a colony of free blacks right across the border, that they had nothing to fear from general emancipation. And he had reason to believe that Mexican officials would support him. By 1830, Mexico had all but abolished slavery. The only place where slavery existed was in Texas because some white Southerners had emigrated to Texas and brought some slaves with them. In 1835, this anti-slavery advocate signed an agreement with the governor of the Mexican state just south of Texas to establish his colony. Here's the third of 4 little stories. In 1832, the United States passed something called the Indian Vaccination Act. And under this act, over the next decade, the United States sent out into the borderlands physicians who vaccinated about 50,000 indigenous people. And they did this because they understood that an epidemic of smallpox that would begin among indigenous nations might easily spread to white people, particularly in the backcountry. But they also did so for the same reason that the United States subsidized the fur trade, to win the goodwill of indigenous nations. Because both Mexico and Britain were also providing vaccine to indigenous people, and the United States wanted to be seen also as a benefactor. Here's the last one. In the mid-1830s, over the space of about 3 or 4 years, about a half dozen Presbyterian missionaries left their homes in Ohio and Connecticut, and they settled in a Dakota village on the Minnesota River, near the present-day border between Minnesota and North Dakota. At the time, the nearest white settlement was about 300 miles away. the missionaries welcomed their distance from white America. They believed that secular American culture was thoroughly sinful, and they'd taken up missionary work not just to try to convert the Dakota to Christianity, but to remove themselves from an America that they believed to be thoroughly saturated by the sins of materialism, drunkenness, carnality, slavery, and Sabbath breaking, in no particular order. They learned the Dakota language, they translated their message into Dakota, and over the next 2 decades, they did their utmost to protect the Dakota from encroaching white settlement, because they, no less than the Dakota, wanted to keep other Americans away from what had become their shared community. So what do each of these 4 stories have in common? Well, first of all, each of them is a chapter of Age of the Borderlands. But more importantly, and the reason why they're chapters, is that each of them contradicts the standard narrative of US expansion that most of us have been taught. Missionaries and fur traders are generally presented as the advance guard of US expansion, not as people who worked to maintain indigenous autonomy. And missionaries and fur traders, at any rate, anti-slavery in Texas. Texas is thought of as the proving ground for slavery in the West. And smallpox, Americans are supposed to have celebrated the deaths of indigenous people to disease because it opened up the West to settlement. So I stumbled onto these stories over many years while I was in the archives researching previous book projects, an environmental history of the bison, an environmental history of the California gold rush, and I came across these other stories in the documents I encountered. And I took notes on them. And on some of them, I wrote up articles about them. But all the while, as I was writing up articles about them, I thought of them as exceptions to the rule. And the rule was manifest destiny. Manifest destiny holds that most Americans thought the United States was entitled, maybe even ordained by God, to expand across the continent. And moreover, that the United States was the dominant power on the continent, and thus had the ability to incorporate more territory into the body politic whenever it chose to. So this map, which is typical of most US history textbooks, I imagine that most of you encountered a map like this whenever you last looked at a history textbook. This represents that view. The parts that became part of the United States are shown neatly with their dates of annexation. What did not become part of the United States is grayed out. This is a map that says the way things turned out is the way things were meant to be. The more I thought about these stories that I'd found in the archives, the more I came to the conclusion that there are so many exceptions to the manifest destiny rule that there's not much left of the rule itself. So I've rather come to think this, and this is the argument I'm going to make tonight, and it's the argument I make in the book. Between the Louisiana Purchase in 1803 and the beginning of the US-Mexico War in 1846, the United States asserted its sovereignty over much of the North American continent, but it was a sovereignty that the United States could do little more than assert. So let me break this down into 2 points. The first point I want to make is this about consensus. So where did the manifest destiny idea come from? Why does it exert such power over our way of understanding the past? And it happened like this. In 1845, the United States was debating the wisdom of annexing Texas. And this guy, John L. O'Sullivan, wrote an editorial in a pro-Democratic Party journal in which he said it is our manifest destiny to overspread the continent, so on and so forth. O'Sullivan was a partisan pundit. It might go a little too far to call him the Tucker Carlson or the Sean Hannity of his day, but it wouldn't go too far by very much. Other highlights of O'Sullivan's career, other than his advocacy of manifest destiny, include being a filibuster for Cuba, a propagandist for the Confederacy, and a spiritualist who claimed to be able to communicate with the dead. The partisanship of O'Sullivan's call for annexation is right there in the first line of his editorial. It is time for opposition to annexation to cease. But you open almost any US history textbook and you'll find manifest destiny presented either implicitly or explicitly as a political consensus. So that's the first point I want to make to you tonight. Expansion was not a consensus. I would like you all to take a moment to imagine a historian 175 years from now writing about the American consensus to annex Greenland. You might say, but yes, true, that hasn't happened and probably won't happen, God willing. Whereas the US did annex Texas, so there must have been some kind of consensus about that. There was in fact considerable opposition to Texas, notably the Whig Party that O'Sullivan was editorializing against in 1845. Northern Whigs, led by John Quincy Adams, neither wanted to add another slave state to the Union, nor did they want to offend Mexico, who regarded Texas as still part of their national territory, just a province that happened to be under rebellion at that moment. So for a decade before 1845, these anti-Texas forces, led by Adams, had quite capably kept Texas out of the federal union. When the Senate tentatively offered statehood to Texas in 1845 in a non-binding vote, it was by a one-vote margin. And when James Polk won election to the presidency on a pro-annexation platform in 1844, it was largely because the two anti-annexation candidates split the vote running against him. So why is it that Manifest Destiny is taught as if it was a consensus? That didn't happen until the 20th century. It was not until after 1900, when the United States had become an empire and was asserting its power in the Caribbean, in the Pacific, and elsewhere, that American historians went back and made Manifest Destiny into something that it had really never been, a consensus. It wasn't until the 1820s, actually, that historians bothered to track down the origin of the term. O'Sullivan had been forgotten by that time. And it was around this time that Manifest Destiny, that historians came to capitalize it. Right? Beware when historians capitalize a term like the Great Awakening or the Progressive Era. It's a way to paper over complexity and lend a sense of coherence to what is really a complicated history. So that was my first point. There is no consensus about expansion. And here's my second point. We have to recognize the tenuousness of the American presence in the borderlands and the weakness of the US state in the first part of the 19th century. So in the 1830s, Americans had no knowledge that the conquest of the continent would be complete by the 19th century. They had no way of anticipating that that was going to happen. To the contrary, in the early 1830s, the US maintained a weak presence in the West, where it was forced to contend not only with powerful autonomous indigenous groups, but also communities of fugitive slaves and competing empires. The United States created a cordon of defensive fortifications, kind of in the Missouri River area. These were not well manned either. The United States in the 1830s had a total military force of about 11,000. Belgium at the same time had a force of about 30,000, to put that in context. There were about 60,000 indigenous men of fighting age within a day's travel of those forts. So I'm going to tell a longer story that serves as an example of how Manifest Destiny does not help us understand American expansion. That story is about the US annexation of Florida. There we go. So again, look in most textbooks or in a recent Pulitzer Prize-winning book by the historian Greg Grandin. And the story about the annexation of Florida will go like this. General Andrew Jackson invaded Spanish Florida with impunity in 1818, attacked Seminole villages, Spanish fortresses, executed 2 British subjects he captured, and demonstrated to the Spanish that their sovereignty over Florida was a fiction. Bullied and chastened by this, Spain signed a treaty with the US the next year in which they gave Florida to the United States. So here's a more complicated and more accurate story. The dominant power in Florida from the 1750s until the 1840s was neither the Spanish nor the United States, nor for that matter the British, who held Florida nominally for about 20 years in that time, but indigenous Seminoles and their black allies, who from here on out I'll call indigenous Seminoles and black Seminoles. The Spanish had founded an outpost at St. Augustine in 1565, and it remained just that, an outpost. It was sparsely populated. Spain could never encourage colonists to go to Florida. But about 100 years later, English slaveholders from the sugar plantation of Barbados founded a colony on the North American mainland. They'd run out of land on Barbados, so they moved to the mainland. And within a few years after the founding of Charlestown, fugitive slaves from Carolina began showing up in St. Augustine. This is one of many runaway slave advertisements that I looked at in writing the book. And you can see that we're afraid they've gone to East Florida, is what most fugitive slave advertisements from South Carolina and Georgia said in these years. Because for most of the next century, the prospect of freedom in Florida remained an enticement to slaves in South Carolina and Georgia. By 1750, 1/3 of the inhabitants of St. Augustine were Black. Enslaved Africans were not the only people to seek refuge in Florida. Also around 1750, an indigenous nation, the Oconee, who were part of the multi-ethnic and multilingual Creek Confederacy, emigrated to Florida. And they were fleeing the indigenous slave trade, which had dominated that region ever since the English had arrived at Charlestown in 1670. Between that time and 1715, the English in Carolina, relying on indigenous people to supply them with captives, the English in Carolina, who relied on indigenous people to supply them with captives from other nations, enslaved between 30,000 and 50,000 indigenous people. Most of those indigenous slaves were then shipped out to one of the English sugar islands in the Caribbean. And the Creek Confederacy supplied a lot of those slaves to the English. So in Florida, the Oconee, who were now called the Seminoles, a Muskogean word for outcasts or refugees, they thrived. They enjoyed material comfort. They were at a safe distance from these slave raids, and more groups left the Creek Confederacy to go to Florida. By the 1790s, there were 3,000 Seminoles in northern Florida. Most African slaves who escaped to Florida eventually found their way to one or another of these Seminole communities. This is a Black Seminole named John Horse. Slavery was not unknown in these Seminole villages. The Seminoles, like other indigenous people in the region, kept both indigenous and Black slaves. But most Black fugitives in Florida became free. By the 1830s, there were about 1,200 free Blacks living among the Seminoles. And there were as well about 200 Black slaves. But slavery among the Seminole villages was nothing like chattel slavery in the US South. Black Seminoles lived separately from their owners. They were free to come and go as they pleased. They were free to marry whoever they chose. They were not subject to any kind of corporal punishment. Their only obligation was to pay 1/3 of the harvest of their crops to their owner. So they were tenants rather than slaves. So as I said, the Spanish had a few outposts on the coast, St. Augustine, St. Mark's, Pensacola, but they ceded effective control over the interior of the Florida Peninsula to the indigenous and Black Seminoles, and Spain was content with that. They didn't really want Florida. They had tried for a century, by the time we get to the 18-teens, to trade Florida to the British in return for Gibraltar, but Britain would never accept that. Slaveholding America was not content with leaving the interior of Florida to the Seminoles. Communities of self-emancipated former slaves in Florida, slaveholders in the US rightly feared, were an inducement to slaves in the lower South to flee to freedom. In fact, until 1820 or so, more slaves fled south to freedom than north to freedom. So in 1816 and again in 1818, the United States invaded Spanish Florida to try to put a stop to this magnet for runaways. So the first US invasion, it targeted a fort on the Apalachicola River just 70 miles south of the US border. During the War of 1812, the British had recruited roughly 3,000 indigenous people and a few hundred fugitive slaves to that coast. They formed the ex-slaves into a corps of British colonial marines. And this was British strategy. In the War of 1812, Britain enlisted about 5,000 American slaves to fight against the US in return for their freedom. They had done the same thing in the American Revolution, similar numbers there as well. In fact, there were slaves who left Washington's plantation at Mount Vernon and Jefferson's plantation at Monticello in order to fight for the British for their freedom. When the British withdrew from this fort on the Apalachicola River in mid-1815 as part of the settlement ending the War of 1812, they officially demobilized this military unit they'd created, but some ex-slaves remained there at the fort, and they had a supply of arms. So in July 1816, Andrew Jackson directed a U.S. force of about 300, composing equal parts of white troops and Creek allies, because remember, the Creeks were enslavers and slave traders. And they descended on that fort and destroyed it. Most of the Black and Indigenous Seminoles had fled before this happened. But that attack was just a prelude to a larger U.S. invasion of Florida. Jackson blustered into Florida in the spring of 1818 with about 1,800 white troops and 1,500 Creek auxiliaries. He targeted 2 Seminole towns. The Seminoles put up brief resistance and then withdrew. Jackson put the towns to the torch. Although his orders specifically forbade him from engaging with the Spanish, Jackson wanted to provoke a war with Spain to try to seize Florida, so he captured both St. Mark's and Pensacola. But then in May 1818, after 3 months in Florida, Jackson declared his campaign ended. He decamped for Tennessee. While many American historians have contended that Jackson's campaign is what prompted the Spanish to give Florida to the United States, it actually accomplished very little. Actually, in January 1818, before Jackson had even invaded Florida, the U.S. Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, and the Spanish envoy to the United States, Luis de Oni, had outlined the general terms of a treaty according to which Spain would cede Florida to the U.S. in return for the U.S. ceding its claim to Texas. And Oni suspended negotiations when Jackson invaded Florida. He only resumed them when U.S. forces withdrew. So the invasion, far from facilitating U.S. sovereignty in Florida, just delayed it. Nor did the campaign break the power of the Seminoles. When it was done, indigenous and Black Seminoles reoccupied their villages or they built new ones. In fact, Black and indigenous Seminoles endured in Florida longer than slavery. In 1832, the U.S. attempted to remove the Seminoles to Indian Territory west of the Mississippi River. Black Seminoles, fearing that removal would mean re-enslavement by white and Creek enslavers, violently resisted removal. The resulting conflict continued until 1842, resulted in the deaths of roughly 1,600 U.S. soldiers. The war only ended when the United States offered the concession that Black Seminoles wanted. If they agreed to removal, the U.S. would formally acknowledge the freedom of Black Seminoles, a remarkable instance prior to the Civil War of African Americans formally securing freedom through violence against the state. In fact, I can't think of another instance in which that happened. In 1842, most Black and indigenous Seminoles decamped for Indian Territory. About 300 remained. In 1854, the U.S. tried again to force the removal of these remaining Seminoles from Florida. By early 1856, the U.S. had mustered about 1,400 troops in the region. In the ensuing war, though, the United States discovered what the Spanish and the British and early Americans had already learned, that they had less effective power than they imagined. The Seminoles raided white settlements. They forced settlers to flee the area. The U.S. simply could not force the Seminoles into a decisive battle, and the Seminoles eluded U.S. troops. After 2 years of conflict, the Seminoles seemed to agree to remove to Indian Territory, but when they assembled to go, there were only 39 men and 85 women and children, clearly far fewer than the number of Seminoles who were really there. A larger number remained ensconced in the Great Cypress Swamp in southern Florida, and what U.S. authorities did was they just decided to pretend that they weren't there and declare a victorious end to this conflict. So they remained there, as I said, outlasting the institution of slavery in the United States. I have one more little thing, and then I'll be done here. So what Jackson's invasion of Florida showed is that the U.S. was not the surpassing power on the continent. In fact, the U.S. could not impose its will. In many ways, Jackson's invasion of Florida was an anomaly. In most cases, the U.S., like Britain and Spain, later Mexico, relied on diplomacy rather than violence and tried to win the goodwill of indigenous nations. Britain, Mexico, and the U.S., for instance, sponsored expeditions into this contested territory in the middle of the continent. Lewis and Clark, when they went into the West, were on exactly one of these expeditions. And when they went west, they distributed gifts such as firearms, cloth, metal implements. They're trying to win the goodwill of indigenous people. And Lewis and Clark, as you can see, also brought with them some smallpox vaccine, because Thomas Jefferson thought they should instruct indigenous people on how to use this, that they might also find this a useful gift. Explorers, whether they were British or American or Spanish, also distributed flags and medals. That is one such flag. I took a picture of that at the Chicago History Museum. These are the symbols of allegiance in native diplomacy. In the North American borderlands, whether you're the United States or Britain or Spain, Mexico, you don't stake your claim to territory by trying to conquer native people. If Florida proves nothing else, it proves that. What you did was you staked your claim to territory by making an alliance with the native people who were there. And the native people, for their part, shifted their allegiances. They played one imperial power off against the other. They hoped to maintain their autonomy by keeping all claims to sovereignty other than their own dependent on their goodwill. So I'll give you a brief example of how this worked, and that's the Indian Vaccination Act of 1832. As I said, the US sent physicians out who vaccinated roughly 50,000 indigenous people. Now, according to the Manifest Destiny paradigm, this should not have happened. White Americans were supposed to welcome the deaths of indigenous people because it means American settlement is easier. So why did it happen? Primarily because the United States was weak. In a multilateral borderland, the US could not impose its will, and it was trying to win the allegiance of natives. So in this context, the smallpox vaccine is just another gift, try to engender good feelings. So in 1832, a physician, Douglas Houghton, accompanied an Indian agent and an army officer named James Allen on a diplomatic mission to the Ojibwa in what's now northern Minnesota. So there's a conference that took place in a large hall, long hall. And at one end of the hall, Houghton vaccinated hundreds of Ojibwa. They're filing past him and he's vaccinating one person after another. And at the other end of the hall, the agent and the army officer, James Allen, were treating with Eshkabagapunza, or Flatmouth, the Ojibwa leader. And they're giving him gifts of tobacco and ammunition. They're trying to win his allegiance. Everybody knew that the Ojibwa were really likelier to be allies of the British if there was ever another war with Britain, because they'd been allies of them in the War of 1812. So the Ojibwa happily received the vaccine at one end of the hall, but Flatmouth threw the medals that had been presented to him at the feet of the American emissaries. He rejected any idea that he should go along with what the United States wanted. And Allen concluded that the Ojibwa, and I'm quoting him, feel inaccessible and secure from any power whatever, even that of the United States. The most the United States could muster was just a tenuous allegiance of native groups who really remained autonomous. So I'll sum this up for you. None of this is to suggest that all Americans had kind attitudes toward indigenous people, or that some Americans did not harbor territorial ambitions for the United States. Jackson, was one of those people. But if we want to understand U.S. relations with indigenous people in the West in the first part of the 19th century, and U.S. territorial ambitions in the West, we have to take into account not just the bloviations of John O'Sullivan or the violence of Andrew Jackson, but the resistance to expansion by Black and indigenous Seminoles, and the rueful acknowledgments of the limits of U.S. power by somebody like James Allen. Thank you. I'm delighted to take questions now, if anybody has any. Yes, Will.
You mentioned that the Ojibwa were eager to get vaccinated. Was vaccination, like that process, was that common knowledge among Native people in the West? So
absolutely it was.
So they didn't have to be convinced by the U.S. government to do it?
No, absolutely it was. So, the smallpox vaccine is discovered in Britain in the late 1790s. It first shows up in the United States around 1800. And Americans were relatively eager to experiment with the smallpox vaccine because smallpox was rampant in Europe. It was less common in the United States, which meant a lot of people grew to adulthood without ever having been exposed as children. So they didn't have any acquired immunity. So white Americans, for one part, were much more willing to experiment with this. Indigenous people similarly lived for the most part, at a far remove from white settlements. And so there are documented instances of indigenous people experimenting with inoculation, not vaccination, but they would find somebody who had had smallpox and recovered from it, and they would get a scab from that person, cut an incision in somebody's arm, and then rub the scab into that arm to intentionally expose them to what they hoped would be a weak version of the disease. So yeah, they were, I was surprised when I encountered the documents about how willing most indigenous communities were to give vaccination a try.
We know, and just one more question about that. We know from this area in Kansas that smallpox was devastating for the native people here once they came in contact with whites. So did that, and of course that started before 1832, but it continued after that. So did this vaccination program, it wasn't applied everywhere? It was fairly extensive. It was about 50,000 indigenous people under the program. There were more indigenous people who were vaccinated under the auspices of different treaties, but it didn't reach every group. So the Pawnees did not get vaccinated, and there was a smallpox outbreak in 1837 that was devastating for them. Whereas the Lakota, farther up the Missouri River, did get vaccinated, and they did pretty well in that epidemic. But there are physicians going out and they are looking for indigenous people where they find them, and they're vaccinating the willing. And in order to transport this vaccine, they're basically harvesting the live vaccine from someone they've just vaccinated in order to transfer it to the next person. So it wasn't as simple as saying they could have vaccinated everybody they wanted to. They did what they could under those primitive circumstances. Jonathan. Professor Hagel.
What brings the age of the Borderlands to an end? And could it have been different? Could we still be living the age of the Borderlands? Is there a world in which whatever brings it to an end doesn't happen and there is no great United States?
That's a great question. So, all right, I'll answer as a. I think that part of what's animating my sort of periodization there, 1790 to 1850, in this period of expansion is being driven by slaveholders. Right? That's what we blithely call Western expansion, we should call Southern expansion, because all the parts of the United States that are added before 1850 are at the behest of slaveholders. It's Florida, first West Florida, then East Florida, and Texas, and even the Louisiana Purchase. The whole point was to just get New Orleans because they wanted an outlet down in the Mississippi, and the rest of that territory was kind of an add-on, right? And all the territories that are added from the Louisiana Territory, all the states, Missouri, Arkansas, Louisiana, before 1845, are all admitted as slave states. So slavery is driving expansion, and it's uneven, and it's halting, and it's contested. Right? After the Civil War, the United States is an industrial nation, and the conquest of the West after the Civil War is this spasm of industrial expansion. It's a different group that's driving it. Right? So that's, in terms of my periodization of how it comes to a close like that, I mean, that's how I would describe that. But at the same time, I would also say, I don't think Borderlands ends. Right? That what defines a borderland for me is it's where the effective power of the state wanes. And that's still the definition, right? That's why there's such consternation about the southern borderland now, or has been for several years, because it's where the effective power of the United States comes to a stop. And so there's a lot of consternation about it then as now. So I think in that sense, it doesn't really end. Does that make sense? Yes.
So you just touched on my question, but Borderlands, because since the 1990s, I taught a course called the Spanish Borderlands in North America, right? That's where the term comes from.
Right.
And in the 2000s, it had become sort of defunct to most people, other than the core of us crazy old timers. But now it's become much more accepted and more widely used.
Mm-hmm.
But that was going to be my question. At what point, it's sort of like the frontier. Where is it?
Yeah.
But that notion of contested frontiers is one definition. But you're applying it essentially to sort of west of the Mississippi in general.
So I'm not actually, which is why I tried to focus on Florida.
Well, there's Florida, yeah.
Yeah, but my sense of the borderlands, it's kind of that's a map on the left of like where the United States people
Right,
really are in 1830. The borderlands is this crescent from Florida through Texas, up through Missouri and into, the upper Great Lakes. And that's in the book, that's where most of the action is taking place. It's where the ability of the United States to actually project the power into places it's claiming kind of comes to an end.
And for Spain, it was up to St. Louis.
Yeah, for
same arc up to St. Louis.
Right. And so you have this contested region in the middle. So I guess my sense of a borderland, again, I've read a lot of that, U.S.-Mexico borderland stuff, and it's great. And there's U.S.-Canada borderland literature as well. What I tried to do in the book is not think about borderlands as a place necessarily, but as a way of understanding the United States in the first part of the 19th century, where you have an aggressively expansionist slaveholding nation, but it doesn't have the power to do everything that it wants, right? Yes.
Struck by your description of the conditions under which diplomacy and engagement might prevail as the effective strategy, as opposed to power.
Mm-hmm.
So what, and the conditions are here you're describing is the recognition of weakness, as opposed to perception of power. It seems like one of those moments where the perception of power over winning competes effectively with some with engagement and respect.
You're talking about now?
But part of the question is that condition of recognition of one's weakness an essential condition for that set of strategies to be dominant?
Yes. Yeah, the short answer is yes. Which is not to say, but there were people like Andrew Jackson and James Polk and others who did not want to recognize those limits. And some of those limits were not material in the sense the United States simply couldn't project power. Some of them were moral, right? And both Jackson and Polk, pushed through those moral boundaries as well. I forgot where I was going with that answer, but
I thought it was very helpful. You were characterizing conditions under which those strategies of engagement, respectful engagement, if you would, might prevail.
Right.
As opposed to power over. And I wonder if it's perception or reality.
Here's where I was going to go with this. That I think that annexation of Texas is a great example of this. So Texas becomes independent or declares its independence from Mexico and immediately requests annexation to the United States. And Northeastern Whigs keep shooting this down, and they successfully shoot it down for 10 years. Until finally, because of the way things broke out, Texas was able to be annexed. Those kinds of expansionists only need to succeed one time. The people who were opposing it needed to be successful every single time for it to work. So, yeah, and I saw that pattern in studying this over and over again. So you can pluck out each one of those instances where the expansionists succeeded and make American history look like that manifest destiny story. It's just one conquest after another. And we've lost sight of how contested and how much resistance there was to it all the way through. Yeah.
From roughly 1830 until 1890, what degree of political and economic power would have been required to protect the plains societies from encroachment? And had there been enough, how long would it have lasted?
Yeah. So that first thing I talked about, this factor to the Osage, he was so successful at his job that he made allies of the Osage and some neighboring groups as well, that they stayed out of the War of 1812, right? That they did not, like a lot of other indigenous groups, ally with the British against the United States. And that then enabled the United States after the war to move into that territory in a position of strength. So in some ways, the policy of creating stability in that region worked so well that it ended up coming back to bite those indigenous groups. By the time you get to the middle of the 19th century, when gold is discovered in California, people start crossing the Great Plains to get there, and then more people start crossing the Great Plains for other reasons to get to Oregon and Utah. That just cuts this swath through the middle of the Great Plains, and the number of bison start declining, in part because whites are hunting them, but in large part in the middle of the 19th century because indigenous people are hunting them and providing those robes to white traders. I guess I'm trying to say I can't think of a way that indigenous people's land holdings would not have been significantly reduced. Right? I can easily think of ways in which they could have hung on to larger chunks and that more the sort of ecological integrity of the Great Plains could have been maintained. But once whites start punching through to get to California and then to get to Colorado for gold there and then to the Black Hills to get to gold there, it becomes harder. So again, when I think of what happened to the West, particularly after about 1850, it's these spasms of expansion, and they're driven by mineral rushes, and war with indigenous people usually follows right after that. I feel like I'm not giving a satisfying question, but I'm going to think about it some more. I answered your question. I'm going to think about it some more. Yeah.
So maybe it's not manifest destiny, but the idea that within the American psyche, spirit, public, from the very beginning, we've been breaking the boundaries and heading west. Daniel Boone crossing the Appalachians, people going into Texas, the creek removal, and the federal road cut through Indian lands, and the white settlers follow. And so then the federal government is forced to go and say, well, we've got the white settlers that are there, they're complaining, so now we've got to go and deal with Indians. Where does that fit into your thesis?
Well, see, this is why I prefer to think of it as borderlands rather than a frontier, because frontier calls up all that kind of, whites versus Indians thing. I think that the long look at the encounter between these two groups it's a story of cultural interpenetration, cultural borrowing, a lot of accommodation. You have white settlers borrowing indigenous crops. You have indigenous people borrowing a lot of white material goods and housing styles, right? When white settlers get to the Osage lands, they kick the Osage out of their houses and take them from them because they are so nice. So what you have is a lot of that kind of accommodation punctuated by spasms of violence. And I mean, I understand why we fixate on the violence and try to create a larger narrative because it's dramatic and it seems to be the moments when things turn. But what's interesting to me is that you have violence between groups that had a lot in common by the time they came to violence. Right? I mean, Andrew Jackson eventually fights with the Creeks, but the Creeks have been his allies for a long time, right? And they were all slaveholders, right? They were kind of fighting over dividing the spoils in some ways. So that's maybe a more complicated answer. Maybe a more complicated answer than, Lucas.
Yes, so I was going to ask, so you talked about how some of the expansion was heavily contested within the federal government. Were programs like the vaccination effort and anti-sufficient methods, did those have a lot of contestants as well, or was it a pretty big consensus?
The vaccination one they were all interesting chapters, right? That was one of the most interesting, in part because Andrew Jackson signed that Vaccination Act into effect, right? kind of blows my mind. I looked and looked to try to find what he was thinking about that, but he just signed it and didn't record any thoughts about it. There are a lot of reasons for that. Americans were wanting to win the goodwill of indigenous people. This is a good gift to give to indigenous nations. They were also afraid of an epidemic blowing back on them. So it's an early public health measure in that respect. And there was also a sense in which they could present themselves as kind of patriarchal benefactors to indigenous people, right? I read some things about how, even though Mexicans were also providing vaccine to indigenous people in California, there's a very much a tall tale about a guy providing vaccine to indigenous people in California, and he contrasts that with, he said, the corrupt baptisms of the friars who don't even check whether the Indians understand what's being done. But see, here we're giving real benefits to them, so they're kind of congratulating themselves about how these lands under Mexico are mismanaged, but when the United States comes, it'll be different. Yeah.
I mean, and there also the countervailing sense that what we would have called the West, Indian territory, was sort of, I mean, Stephen Long's the Great American Desert. Right? We'll just move all those native peoples there. It's 1832, it's the Indian Removal Act. A sense that we're not aiming for that property. We're willing to give it to somebody else, and perhaps one of the carrots to them is the vaccination, or we'll look after you kind of thing, because we're never going to want that, right? You guys go take that.
Even more than that, when Stephen Long writes of the Great Plains as the Great American Desert, he says this will be a great barrier to Mexico or Britain invading us from that direction, because nobody could, who could go through this territory? Right. So, yeah, that was, to me, that's another indication of the sort of weakness of the United States. They're looking to natural barriers. William Keating, who was exploring up in Minnesota around the same time, says the same thing about northern Minnesota. It's so swampy and full of mosquitoes, nobody will ever attack us through here. Yeah.
I want to try and zoom out with my question. What are the lessons that we can take from your book and the idea of manifest destiny, and to kind of tying it to a broader context of settler colonialism?
No.
So, I mean, I think that settler colonialism is a view from 30,000 feet. This idea that whites are displacing indigenous people around the world, and from 30,000 feet, yeah, that is what's happening. The closer you get to the surface, the more complicated and less theoretically satisfying settler colonialism becomes, right? Because you find, well, suddenly not all fur traders are doing terrible things, and not all missionaries are doing terrible things, and why is the United States trying to vaccinate indigenous people? How does that fit into that? I am temperamentally a non-theoretical kind of historian, and I prefer to look at facts. And every time I've gone to any project I've done, I come into it with an abstract idea about what I think the big arc is going to be. And every time I get into the archives and look at the documents, I find that the people in the past just won't conform to those big abstract ideas like settler colonialism. Yeah.
Back to the Osage factor, and when you saw that shift, and I mean, obviously Missouri statehood in 1821, the pressure from the slaveholding states to expand, that transition and displacement of the Osage, and the essentially change in policy, did you see that coming into being in a de facto sense, followed by the paperwork and documentation that we're going to do this way, or was there a written policy that seemed to show up that was part of that transition?
It was absolutely, there was a whole federal system of factories. So this factor at Fort Osage was not the only one. They were spread throughout that whole crescent of the borderlands that I talked about. And it had to be up for recertification every 3 or 4 years. And it was a Missouri senator, the original Thomas Hart Benton, who did it in, because at the behest of private fur traders who really wanted to get rid of this government agency that was underselling them. And so, yeah, there was a huge debate in Congress, and they got rid of it in order to open up what they were really looking at was the upper Missouri, which they knew was going to be really rich with furs. So yeah, it was explicitly, now that the War of 1812 is over, and we don't have to worry about indigenous people being allies of the British because there's been a rapprochement between the British and the United States, maybe we don't need to be courting the goodwill of the Osage anymore. We can go back to exploitation.
We had a question online. Since you are a historian of environmental history, what role does environmental history play in this book?
Well, I took out the environmental stuff for this talk, but this is mostly a story about power, right, and relative power. It's really applicable to the story in Florida because the Spanish, and particularly the British, were like, we can put together a plantation society here. They try to grow indigo, they try to grow sugar, and none of these plantation crops that worked in the Caribbean worked in Florida. The soil wasn't right, it was a little too cold. And one of the reasons that the Black and Indigenous Seminoles endured is that they had a communal way of growing their traditional crops of corn, beans, and squash. They also adopted citrus fruits from the Spanish. They adopted raising cattle from the English and the Spanish. When Black slaves ran away and joined indigenous communities, they brought with them techniques of cultivating rice. So they had this much more cooperative, and you will try different things that work. So one of the reasons they were able to endure and plantation colonization failed, which is another strike against settler colonialism, was that they just weren't good at it. Right? The Black and Indigenous Seminoles understood the environment a lot better. Yes, no.
So you talk about how the government is using a lot of new items and innovations as gifts to indigenous peoples as they're traveling through, whether it be vaccinations or firearms or alcohol or any of these things. Do you think that these types of gifts or innovations actually aided the U.S. in expanding westward, or more often than not resulted in unforeseen circumstances by putting all these items out into the unorganized territory?
I think that in the 1830s, 1840s, into part of the 1850s, the United States is not thinking about expanding westward. We have to set aside the sort of teleology that this is where they're heading. They're just trying to keep the peace on the frontier, and they're trying to make allies of these indigenous people so that they don't ally with the British or the Mexicans. Right? So in that sense, this diplomacy of gift giving is what they were engaged in. Right? They didn't know where this was going. Yes, I'm sorry. Did you have that up earlier and I just didn't see you?
Yeah, I'm sure back here. I'm curious, I think building off of that last question, right, talking about opposition to expansion in the antebellum period, especially these Whigs that, like you mentioned in your talk, they're opposed to one type of expansion, right? The expansion of slavery, the expansion of the slave powers, they would call it. I'm curious if in your book, do you touch on, for instance, these northern working members of the Workingmen's Party, George Henry Evans, who is definitely advocating for expansion, and later Whigs in the 1840s and even free soilers. I know you ended your book in 1850, so I'm a little curious about that. What you do with these free soilers that are pro-expansionists in many ways, and then why also you stopped at 1850, maybe not 1854, 1855.
I could still be writing this book, So the Free Soilers come out of the Democratic Party. The original nominee of the Free Soil Party is former Democratic President Martin Van Buren. The Whigs were not just opposed to the expansion of slavery, and there were Southern Whigs who were slaveholders. What they were mostly opposed to was having lots of white settlers disperse over the entire continent. They didn't want that. They wanted to keep American settlement kind of tightly bound within existing borders, and that's why they're all about internal improvements, railroads and roads and canals and connections, and we will build up a commercial economy by staying more sort of focused inward on ourselves, rather than sprawling across the continent in small land holdings. And yeah, that, my understanding of the Whig political economy is that was much more what they were thinking. So they were opposed, Northern Whigs were certainly opposed to slaveholding interests, but for the most part, what they wanted was, people like Henry Clay from Kentucky wanted this sort of program of internal improvements and keeping the American population more centered and tightly knit together commercially. Does that answer your question? You seem skeptical.
Yeah, a little bit. Well, I'm curious. I mean, going back to the working men's party of the 1830s, right? People like George Henry Evans, who are absolutely advocating for free soil, free labor, free men, decades earlier. Start to hear that term. Who are advocating for, you know, the placement of these small, almost utopian communities, certainly further west than we have large settlements. So what do you do? You know, what do you do with those characters that are advocating for expansion?
Nobody's saying that there aren't people advocating for expansion, right? What I'm saying is the whole idea of expansion is highly contested. And people who want to go out into the West and form communities, there are lots of people who are doing this. That guy I talked about, Benjamin Lundy, who tries to create this community of emancipated slaves in Texas, that's a kind of expansion. It's just a different kind of expansion than the one we're used to hearing about. Those missionaries who went out to Minnesota, again, they're expanding the footprint of the United States, but it's just a different kind of footprint than what we're used to. What I'm mostly concerned about is the inability of the United States to effectively move its sovereignty out there. There was no way the United States could actually prevent experimental communities from moving out west. And those two things I just mentioned were both experimental communities of a certain type. Right? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
All right. Yes, Nathan.
Wonderful talk. I'm completely convinced that you have two
exceptions.
two kind of interrelated questions that I want to pose about this notion of manifest destiny. So could a skeptic say about your book, well, we just need to push back the notion of manifest destiny to a little bit later in the century as sort of their solution? And I think based on your answer to Jude's question, you've already shown that manifest destiny is like this big picture narrative that's created rather than the messiness of what's happening on the ground. So that's the first part. And the second part has to do with this big picture narrative. So scholars of nationalism have, Hopflow and Ranger especially, talk about the invention of tradition. And it seems to me that manifest destiny is the invention of tradition. Ernest Renan, already in 1882, writes about what is a nation, and for him, it's knowing what to forget.
Yeah.
So in your past, like you agree to forget certain things. So I'm wondering if, back to the two-part question, is manifest destiny always that, or is there a way that people are self-consciously doing this later? And your book's just showing it's not happening in this period.
So if you do a Google Ngram for manifest destiny, nothing blipped in the 1830s, and it spikes up in 1840s, and then it disappears for the rest of the 19th century. And you can find a couple mentions of it in the later part of the 19th century, almost always as a term of opprobrium. The United States should not get involved in manifest destiny things in Latin America when Blaine is Secretary of State. And there's no idea that only the United States has a manifest destiny. Critiques of the Russians and the Ottomans are described as their manifest destiny, right? And again, it's always a term of opprobrium. Right? So it's really only after 1900 that historians do exactly what you described. They create a tradition. Once the United States is an empire and is taken the Philippines and we're in Nicaragua and other parts of the Caribbean, that historians went back and they do that terrible thing that historians do, and they smoothed out the unevenness and they made it seem like it was always going to be this way. We were always an empire, right? And the first historian to do that was Teddy Roosevelt, who doesn't use the term manifest destiny, but he comes really close. And he says things like, you know, in the U.S.-Mexico War, the United States pushed the Spaniard, as he put it, you know, from Texas, and we've concluded that now in the late war against Spain. You know, he just makes it an unbroken story, right? And yeah, again, I don't want to be the historian who flies from 30,000 feet. To me, it's much more interesting closer to the surface. Yes.
So would it just be improper for history in general to say that a certain event or series of events is inevitable?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yes.
So I'm not a historian. All I know is this beautiful painting of this woman going across the stage.
Yes.
I just looked it up. That was 1872.
Yep.
So where?
John Gast, American Progress.
How did that fit into why did that become such a symbol in 1872?
Well, it wasn't a symbol of anything in 1872. It was so first of all, I don't know if you've ever seen the painting itself. You probably imagine it as a huge canvas. It's hanging in the Autry Museum in Los Angeles. It's about the size of an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper. You miss it when you first, because it's on the wall with other things. Yeah. And it was a Western travel company that hired Gast to do this illustration of, book us to, book your travel west. And it's again, like Theodore Roosevelt creating this sort of image of we've always been an empire. Later on, we've decided that, yeah, that's what Americans were thinking. And, certainly an image created in 1872 is not saying anything about what people were thinking in 1845, and I'm not even sure it says anything much about what people were thinking in the 1870s.
So it's travel related.
Yeah.
Kind of.
Yeah.
All right.
Yes, definitely.
Somebody asked you whether it all could have been different.
Yeah.
And I would propose that initially it was different if you go north. If you think of Canada, that without a claim to manifest destiny, and without any claims to having a right to expand in the Pacific Ocean, they actually managed to do it without Custer, without Jackson. And you look at that, it started out as that little smear of magenta on your map. That's Canada, but somehow it did exactly what we did in this country, essentially, coast to coast to the Arctic, without having to have Indian wars, without having to have mass extermination. Not perfectly, but you see what I mean?
Yeah, I see what you mean.
Looking for what could have been.
Yeah, what they didn't have is what became the biggest slave society in the Americas. And as I said, it was slaveholders who were driving expansion in the first part of the 19th century. So yeah.
That is really the big difference.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't have.
Mike looks skeptical now.
Well, no, you know a lot more about this than I do. And I'm thinking about this, about what Canada not had. Correct me if I'm wrong. Canada also didn't have the massive gold fields.
There was a gold rush to British Columbia in the 1850s.
Yeah.
Not as big as the California gold rush, but there was a gold rush to British Columbia in the 1850s.
I'm thinking about also, Georgia, Colorado.
Yeah,
Black
no,
Hills,
yes, yeah.
Comstock. It's all across.
Agreed. Yes.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Oh.